All right, today we're going to dig into a huge challenge, something that so many remote contact centers are struggling with. And it's this: why does your company culture seem to just fall apart, even when you've got amazing leaders trying their best? We're going to break down the real, systemic reasons this is happening and look at a pretty powerful way to rebuild it. Let's get into it. This is the question that keeps operations leaders up at night. You're doing all the right things, right? You invest in a ton of training, you hire people who believe in your values, you're constantly communicating, but somehow inconsistency just creeps in. Pretty soon, your teams in different regions or on different shifts feel like they're working for completely different companies. So what is really going on?
And here it is. This is the fundamental shift in thinking that we have to make. Your culture isn't breaking down because your people have bad intentions, not at all. It's breaking down because good intentions on their own just can't survive without a system to guide them and reinforce them day in and day out. We're taking the focus off individual blame and putting it where it belongs, on the structure.
Okay, so let's be super clear about something. Remote work doesn't actually create new cultural problems. What it does is act like a giant magnifying glass on the tiny little inconsistencies that were probably already there. It takes those small cracks in how your leaders operate and just blows them wide open into major gaps.
What's so important to understand is just how predictable this is. I mean, think about it. In a remote setup, your supervisors have way fewer shared cues. They can't just glance across the office to see how a colleague is handling a tough situation. Communication is often delayed, feedback takes longer to get back, and what happens? Leaders are forced to fall back on their own personal judgment. And that right there is the perfect recipe for things to start going in different directions.
So this going in different directions thing, it has a name. We call it drift. And honestly, understanding drift is the absolute key to fixing culture erosion. So let's break down exactly how it starts, how it spreads, and how it ends up watering down the very culture you've worked so hard to build. It all starts small, at the individual level, with what we call supervisor drift. This is that moment a supervisor starts leading based on their own habits, or what feels easier when they're under pressure, instead of sticking to the company standard. One leader coaches an agent one way, and another leader coaches a slightly different way. It seems so minor, but believe me, it is the first step toward a huge problem.
So you might be asking, why does this drift even happen? Well, the answer is something called the reinforcement gap. Look, you can send a leader to the best training program in the world, but that knowledge starts to fade the second they're back on the job with a dozen things demanding their attention. That gap, it's the space between the training room and the real world. And without a system to bridge it, drift is pretty much inevitable.
And this is the end result. When all that individual supervisor drift is allowed to spread unchecked across that reinforcement gap, you get culture dilution. Your core values, your standards, they get weaker because they're being interpreted and applied differently all over the place. Your culture stops being this unified force and just becomes a random collection of individual leadership styles.
And man, does it scale fast. It's like a domino effect. It starts with microdrift, a supervisor just using slightly different words. Then that grows into execution drift, where whole teams are now operating with different rules. And before you even know it, you've got full-blown cultural drift. And that mission statement you have on the wall, it just doesn't match what's happening on the ground anymore.
But what's actually pushing all this drift? Because it's not just a passive thing. There are these really powerful, totally invisible human forces that are always at play, and they make old-school training pretty much useless. We call them the FONE Factors.
Now, this is absolutely crucial. The FONE Factors are not personality flaws. They are predictable, hardwired parts of being human that affect every single one of us. So the key isn't to try and get rid of them. You can't. The key is to build a system that manages them.
First up, we've got fear. This is the fear of conflict, of making a mistake, or getting negative feedback from an agent. It's what causes a supervisor to hesitate when they really should act, or to soften a tough but necessary message. It's that little voice inside that says, maybe I'll just let this one slide.
Next is overconfidence. And let me tell you, this one is probably the most dangerous of all. This is your experienced leader, the one who thinks, I got this. I know exactly how to handle this. I've done it 1,000 times. So they rely on their own personal playbook, totally confident they're doing the right thing, while drifting further and further from the company standard. Confident mistakes scale incredibly fast.
The N in FONE is for negative impressions.
This is all about the desire to look competent, to look like you're in control. It's what stops a supervisor from asking a question when they're not sure about something. They'd rather guess and maybe get it wrong than risk looking like they don't know the answer. This just masks confusion and lets drift grow in silence.
And finally, there's execution blindness, and this really goes two ways. Senior leaders, they can't see the tiny day-to-day drift that's happening on the front lines. And at the same time, individual supervisors can't really see how their peers are leading their teams. Without that visibility, drift just spreads like a virus, completely unseen, until your big metrics, like customer satisfaction or attrition, finally crash.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, the mechanics behind it, and these hidden forces. It sounds pretty daunting, right? So now let's talk about the solution. How do you fight something this big? Well, you don't fight it with another weekend training seminar. You fight it with a system, and that system is called a leadership execution system. Let's just compare the old way with the new way. Traditional training is an event. It's a one-and-done thing that relies on memory. And as we've seen, it creates that reinforcement gap where all those FONE factors just run wild. A leadership execution system, or an LES, is the total opposite. It's a continuous process that puts guidance right into the daily workflow. It closes that gap, and it manages the FONE factors with structure, not just with hope.
So what does an LES actually do? Well, it takes your big, kind of abstract cultural ideas and it breaks them down into tiny, concrete behaviors. Then it gives prompts and checklists to your supervisors at the exact moment they need to perform that behavior. It creates real feedback loops, it makes the why behind every change crystal clear, and, this is huge, it connects recognition and measurement right into the daily grind.
I absolutely love this analogy because it just makes the whole concept click. In a modern factory, you don't just hope that every part of the assembly line happens correctly. No way. You have a system, an MES, that guides it, tracks it, and makes sure it happens. An LES does the exact same thing, but for leadership behaviors. It literally systematizes consistency.
And because it's a system, you can measure it. This is a game changer. It lets you shift away from only looking at lagging indicators like turnover, after the damage is already done, and start monitoring the real-time health of your leadership culture.
These are the kinds of metrics that really tell you what's going on. The consistency index, that tells you what percentage of leadership actions are being done the way you intended. You can track engagement signals, you can check on your culture's health by asking about clarity and fairness, and then you can tie it all back to real business impact. Fewer escalations, less rework, and lower attrition. You're finally measuring the cause, not just the effect.
So we'll end with the single most important question you can ask yourself and your team. Is your culture built on the good intentions of your leaders, leaving it vulnerable to drift and all those hidden human factors? Or is it hardwired for success by a deliberate, thoughtful execution system? Because at the end of the day, the answer to that question will determine whether it survives.